为什么呀？没有啊，我关了。
乘坐人有眼瞓、有反應慢，仲要揸車，透過可以好嚴重。
三沙個音啊，即係冇擺入啲飯嗰度啊，應該會翻售嘅。
新聞時間，21歲男人2019年喺港鐵觀塘站外用大刀割傷警員警道，喺高等法院承認觸犯傷人罪，8星期不判刑。事發時就讀中嘅話，佢通歷2019年10月13號喺觀塘港鐵站天橋用大刀割傷一名警員嘅右手，並移送往觀塘館，被控起動謀殺罪同監禁嘅觸犯傷人罪。被告喺庭上承認觸犯傷人。係同時話自己因為平成數，咁佢有呢個錯先減補貼。前方大律師就話，仲有個案自費作假在內，容易受影響，令到行政責任甚至用可能條嘅程序，或減到4分1死刑。法官裁定為參審將佢嘅謀殺罪呈往法庭，但判決下個星期一判刑。全國港澳研究會會長徐實話。如果香港嘅民主制度唔能夠有效保障愛國者治港，香港必會無虞。副會長黃振龍就表示，香港民主並非西式，亦非我哋化，而係一個港式資本主義民主制度。佢做北京記者梁卓輝話：全國港澳研究會舉辦以一國兩制下香港的民主發展為題嘅研討會，會長徐澤致辭嘅時候話：過去幾年香港出現種種現象。尤其根本原因係香港社會喺重大嘅政治法律問題上缺乏共識。特別是在一些實行基本法的實在人和所謂的或者經濟的不懂存在的各種公司的偏見誤解，而且其中有些人上過總理有意欺騙，從一些所謂的公司從限制數字的利用。反正我这个身边的提供非常有趣，其实不太知道，以为在香港发生的红色革命所证明，其中港府主张的这个在其他地方在往香港的人们持续的直到这个选香港人都是買餸就梗係唔買啦，買一隻豬肉嘅幾多，買一斤菜又買咁多啦，又開咗，買咗來得啲兩錢大花，但係平時你有嘥咁多，得嗰2檔，正式好似兩檔。但係有生意咯，係買用真係話，香港唔能夠再因為民主而失去秩序，而一國兩制之下嘅香港社會關係仍然非常廣闊，但係令到政府無法即強調嘅民主唔能夠要。內地係關注我哋嘅香港選擇合適時間，中國都話佢用年需要時間。但係人呢個咧有係啊，我試過半大咯，咁樣睇落咧，真係知道我全數，因為其實一做出嚟㗎，一包個雞蛋就㗎，佢一直到時要喺新選區制度點樣同中央想法對接等等，再決定點樣推行普選。無線電視駐北京記者梁卓輝報道。日本最快3月為民眾接種加強劑，應對變種新冠病毒不密切發生，又宣布將限制外國同入境嘅措施延長至2月底。澳洲嘅新冠確診持續高企，相對3年前更受壓。日本受到變種新冠病毒不明影響，新一波疫情未有緩和跡象，首相岸田文雄公布更多措施應對。 重點放喺強化變種疫苗。
人哋未喐我啊！
宣布會為而家未合資格
你喐我啊！
細路仔
我揾電話。
治療性質，如果利用現有嘅疫苗庫存，先為高危長者第三針加強劑，而到到商業會擴展至一般市民。按照廠房吸納已經全面額外提供1,800萬劑疫苗，自衛隊設立嘅疫苗接種中心都會作接服務。至於舊年11月實施限制外國人入境嘅措施，會延長至2月底。另一方面，疫情嚴峻嘅沖繩縣，防衛省話會應支持疫情單嚟嘅請求，派醫療專家到當地協助抗疫。鄰國嘅南韓星期一再多接近3,100宗病例，佢連續5日低於4,000宗，超過60成嚟自首都圈。當局將於星期3決定採購同埋使用新冠病毒可測嘅方案，並且喺星期5決定檢驗防疫措施。澳洲單日新增接近86000宗確診，目前仍然有大約4000人住院，係一個星期前嘅接近1倍。死亡個案就有25宗。當局同肆虐令到當地血系統受壓。維多利亞州州長安德魯斯話，當地大約有合共超過4400個醫院同埋救護車員工因為隔離而缺勤，救護車服務出現供不應求。無線電視記者點擊報道。
新變種新冠病毒當局同肆虐下，美國嘅疫情持續惡化，新增感染同入院人數急速打破當地疫情以來嘅紀錄，當中新增確診更加創下全球各國單日新高。衞生醫療警告，英國緊急州1月宣布嘅醫療體系。
疫情嚴重，加重當地醫療系統負擔。美國嘅統計顯示，當地星期一新增35萬宗新確診，打破幾日前嘅紀錄之外，亦都創下各國疫苗嘅單日新低。至於住院人數仍然有增無減，有多達135000人，超越1年前嘅132000人嘅紀錄。喺疫情嚴重嘅環境，有啲反映因為入院嘅人員大增，又話好多人入院住院都接發現確診，反映變種病毒嘅問題已經非常高感染程度。近於大量員工感染，3條地鐵線嘅服務宣布暫停。藥廠方面話有需要為當場免費專門疫苗，最快3月可以面世。而英國單日更多142000幾人檢疫，數字雖然較過去疫情回落，但英格蘭嘅入院人數就增加至17000人，係舊年連續3年最多。當局鼓勵大眾接種疫苗，強調係安全有效。加上零售商而家加速宣布，所有英國人接種新冠疫苗嘅僱員，如果因為防疫需要隔離，其他佢哋嘅薪金會削減大約3%以上。首相約翰遜前年封城期間，同惡意首相府長走罪嘅風波持續發酵。有報道話，首相府超過100個員工當時獲電郵邀請至會酒水參加派對，首相府拒絕接見。無線電視記者楊天報道。
NBA 黃蜂主場贏得64分，兩隊20次加強領先，藍衫黃蜂半場落後1分，到下半場佔優，黃星亞都攞最高27分，第三節試過拉開15分，但美隊將比賽至23分，16分喺下半場攻入，到了第四節收窄差距，喺度隊交出27分10個助攻，傳俾佢嘅前老幫摩入荷擔堡，新標做出3雙。英隊26分13球8助攻，最後38.8秒射入天港島入球，雖然射失，但就埋邊啲補入，將成績19平手。不過波以最後5秒衝入，黃蜂贏得8強3比99，3日內30分球。天氣方面，預測今晚大致天晴，聽日漸轉多雲，早晚清涼，市區嘅低氣溫大約15度，新界11幾度。日間短暫時間有陽光，最高氣溫大約19度。無論是天氣下風，聽日轉吹風至東風，展望隨後2、3日天氣持續清涼，星期日同星期一係幾陣雨。而家嘅氣溫係16度，相對濕度59%。環保署
Okay, good evening. For those in the classroom, do I have to use the mic? Or it's better? Hello, hello. For those who attend lecture while Zoom, are you able to see my first slide, which is a photo of Hong Kong? Okay, thank you very much. And is my voice clearly heard? I think so. Okay, good evening and welcome to this first lecture of POL5703, Contemporary Issues of Housing and Urban Management. We have been running 5703 for a number of years, but previously we only cover housing management. And because of the restructuring of the program, and we need to incorporate urban management. We need to shift the focus a little bit. So that's the first year of trial, and we are not quite sure that we are pitching at the so-called perfect angle or scoop. So if you have any suggestion, do raise to me or to Dr. Wang, so that we can sort of adjust the delivery in the course, so that we can sort of have sort of better frame the course to suit your need. Because it's easier to define housing management or property management, but it's a little bit confused with urban management, not because it is not focused enough, but because it's too broad. So that's why we may choose to narrow a little bit and make it closer to housing management. But in fact, the underlying sort of theories and concepts are more or less so-called general. Okay, this lecture is an overview, so I'll try to have an outlook of what we'll deliver in this course in the next 12 weeks or so, and also to introduce some of the theoretical basis. We organize our materials and the analysis. Although that is only an underlying theoretical basis, it doesn't mean that we use the same sort of theory throughout the 12 lectures. But that is the angle we'll look at those phenomena, because studying housing and urban management can take many perspectives and many angles. So in fact, we have quite a specific angle to look at that match with our discipline of research, which I'll expand it later. But first of all, let me introduce myself. most of you have met me either in the orientation program or in one of the lecture last year with the stream. I'm Ming Yip. I'm the Professor of Housing and Urban Studies in the Department of Public Policy. I'm also a registered professional housing manager and have been chairman of the Chartered Institute of Housing Asian Pacific branch for 2 years. And until 2 years ago, I was still the executive member of the branch. I'm also a member of the Subsidized Housing Committee of the Hong Kong Housing Authority, and also a member of the Task Force on the Tenancy Control. So I have a little bit experience on how decision-making on housing has been made. And also the Subsidized Housing Committee discuss basically not policy, in fact, it's more of the operation of housing management in the public sector. So I'm pretty familiar with all those sort of policy because I've been researching housing policy in Hong Kong and in other Asian cities in the past 25 years. And co-teach with me is Dr. Jun Wang, the program leader of the MHUM, and she'll also take in 2 seminar groups as well. And also Dr. Betty Yong, one of the tutor and also responsible for 1 lecture in this course. So some usual business we have to mention why we designed this course. We designed this course is we want to introduce some issues in housing and urban management. But we introduce in a way that we emphasize more on the institutional organizational arrangement of the system. Because housing and urban management can be studied as a technical subject. So housing is about the structure, is all about the engineering work. For urban management is even much wider than that. It can be water supply, it can be transport, it can be road, it can be railway. I mean, all sort of infrastructure, the usual area of study of urban management, of course, also including housing. But we will not introduce it as a technical subject, but we want to outline the operation and the development, and particularly the governance of the system. So don't expect us to dip into very minute operational details of both housing and urban management. We will probably look at it from the sky. So have an overview of that. But in particularly, we would like to have the institutional and organizational arrangement. But of course, we will also look at some of the designs and operation, but we tend to connect it with some kind of theories in housing and urban studies. And with that, we hope that we are not just introducing the concept, the theory, the operation, the institution, but also help you to have a critical appraisal of those theories and technique, both through our lecture and also through our so-called seminar, that you make the presentation, that you do your term paper. So of course, I mean, this is our intended outcome. Hope we can deliver that. But if we cannot, please alert us in what way you feel inadequate in that. So this is on urban housing management. Housing is easier to grasp because it's a little bit more concrete. What is urban? We don't want to push urban to some kind of limitless scope of coverage. And we will try to make it more concrete so that we are looking at how cities are managed. But of course, cities around the world are so different. So different country, different cities, because of all the geography, of history, of the economic development, of all the infrastructure development, they are all being managed in different ways. But whereas cities in this part of the world, Asia, particularly East Asia, China and Hong Kong, they share many commonalities that make both the city development and how the cities are managed, which is quite different from the European experience, and of course, even more distance from the North Americans experience. Later on, I'll contrast this, why we analyze the system in this way, the institution this way, because we have a special character of that. So whatever you mentioned about Hong Kong, Tokyo, Shanghai, or Taipei, they share a lot of commonality on that. And so we can discuss the very basic operation and institution, organization of urban housing management in a similar way. But of course, each city has its special characteristics, which are also returned later. But why cities is important and what will be our focus? I just mentioned that we may not be able to cover everything about how the city is managed, which is too big for us to handle in this course. And also we need to shift the focus a little bit on housing because of the need of half of the class in knowing more about housing management. But these two are related and they have a common joining point, which I'll unfold later. Cities is important because cities is important as a spatial unit for all our activities. We need space to arrange our daily life, to fulfill all the functional necessity we have. So that's a spatial unit. But city is also a social unit because within the city, it is not just individuals. Individuals are connected with different institutions through the setup of organizations. And we cannot just look at those geographic distribution, the physical building, but we need to look at how people interact in different sort of space. So in this, we need to mention the special characteristic of a city, and the other extreme we will also mention is about home. So in fact, cities and home are the two ends of the extreme of the continuum that will describe space and will describe social relations. Cities is something that we usually will connect with public. They are public. Whereas home is private. So on their own, there are a lot of studies on that. So there's a lot of study on the cities. So basically urban studies is the discipline that will study the cities in a very thorough way. Whereas home is also a center of concern for some discipline like sociology, like geographies, and some other discipline like psychology. They will look at how the family members within the household they interact. So they are largely in a modern society, private. But in this course, we try to find somewhere between those continuum that we think have a special reason why we need to study that in a more thorough way. But of course, we also study the city. Later on, I'll mention that. And Dr. Huang will focus more on the city. So on city planning, on how the city can be developed. Whereas I will not focus on the home because that's not my expertise. And also that may not be the interest of most of you because half of the class have an interest on housing management. In fact, housing management from our perspective may not be a proper expression of what, in fact, we have to look at. We do not want to look at how housing is managed, in fact. Why I say that? Because later on, I'll illustrate why we have to distinguish home and the city. if this is in a North American context, in a North American suburban middle-class community, what will be the arrangement of the space on that? So also many communities in Canadian cities, like Vancouver, like Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, most of those places, people live in houses. So behind the door, the front door or the back door of your house are your complete private space. You have to take care of all those that. So if we say housing management, the housing management is all done by the individual households. Whereas when you open the door and step to the street, that is public. And that will be the responsibility of the city. So if we talk about urban management in that, of course, there's cleaning, there's transport. So this is all the services provided by the city. Of course, on their own, they have a lot of complicated issues we need to study. But whereas in this part of the world, in Hong Kong, many big cities in China, in big cities in other East Asian countries, there is something that we organize in a very special way that's not that popular in the West. So of course, in the United States, you also have high buildings, big community, but that's an exception, not the norm. Whereas in this part of the world, in big cities, that is almost the only way people live. So that is what we call housing. But in fact, we are not just managing housing, it's more than that. It's more than that. Because with this, we are in fact creating something very different from cities in Europe and cities in the United States or Canada. Because we are creating what we call a multi-family, multi-story buildings, and many of them, in fact, even organized in a gated neighborhood. So that is something that we are interested at, because that is exactly the junction that urban management and management of a private home interact. And that creates very interesting interaction, which are quite unique in cities, particularly cities in Asia or East Asia. And also particularly apparent, the contradiction, in cities, in Chinese cities like Hong Kong and other big Chinese cities in the mainland, because that will create a different ownership system. So that is a system in the name of private ownership, but it's not exactly private, because some of the areas in those neighborhoods, they are not owned by private individuals, but by a collection of private individuals, what we call collective ownership. And because of that, the service delivery will be very different. So I just mentioned, if I live in Toronto, behind my door, that's my responsibility. Outside of my door is the city's responsibility. But whereas if this is organized in some kind of collective ownership, it's neither the city nor the individual household's responsibility. We need to provide services in those areas in a very special way. So to put it simple, most of the arrangements are organized in the form of private provision of public services. So if I live in Toronto or in the suburb of LA, when I have to dump my garbage, I have to put it outside of my house in a special sort of dustbins. And the cities and the city's cleaning department will pick it up either every day or every other day. So I don't have to pay for that, in fact. Of course, you indirectly pay for that through local tax. But I would say that all of you, if you live in cities, in this part of the world, that is a very different experience. You need to pay for somebody to collect those garbage for you before they collected it and hand it to the hygiene department of the city. So that should be some kind of public service. We already pay the tax, but we have to pay extra for other people to collect it from somewhere near my flat to some point in the neighborhood that they will get all those sort of garbage in the neighborhood. So similarly, security service is something like that, and you even have to pay for the maintenance of the road, which your neighbors, your neighboring sort of community may pay it through sort of tax, local tax. So that makes the private provision of public service a little bit special. And also governance as well. The cities is governed by various systems, either democratic or administrative. But because of that collective ownership, you need to set up separate institutions for decision-making and ownership. So that is something make those so-called junctions complicated. Because of that, new social relations emerge. Social relation within the neighborhood between owners, which you need to make this collective decision-making. And this organization may interact with the local city government in some very interesting way. It depends on the dynamics of the political system and also the dynamics of what we call the local social system. And that is the basis that we will say that our interest of urban management and housing management now will be reframed as how we look at some neighborhood with collective ownership is being managed. That is, you may say that may be something trivial because there is not much we can discuss. But if you look at it deeper, it is not the case, because at least there are several areas that you can expand that to treat it as a window for the larger so-called social system. I take just an example. Within those decision-making organizations, what kind of decision-making mechanism you are going to set up? Is it democratic? So if it is democratic, what kind of democracy it is? And because it is a much manageable size, so in fact, you can have a venue, you can look at very detailed interaction, how democracy is being operated and what are the decision-making, are they the result of democratic decision-making? Even push it a little bit further. So for those of you who have studied some politics or political theories, we have a different kind of so-called democracy. So the most common one that are quoted are those representative of democracy, like those who experience in the United States or in some Western European country. So you elect the legislator to make a decision for you. So they are the representative. But the other end is they advocate direct democracy. So every individual should have the decision-making power. So perhaps Switzerland is one of such example. So they have referendum every month. So any big decision-making of their so-called state, they call it canton, should be made directly by individuals, voters. So this is a form of so-called direct democracy. But there may be something in between. So organizing community participation with decision-making at the neighborhood may be some form of some academics have proposed, they call it associational democracy. So if everybody have direct democracy in their neighborhood, and then the neighborhood can act as their representative for a bigger issues with the cities of the nation, it may be something in between that perhaps take the benefit of so-called both kind of democracy. Whereas later on, I'll also mention that in China, this neighborhood governance, in fact, give us a variable window to look at how individuals interact with the state, particularly in an environment that we still would largely describe China's political system as authoritarian. So participation of individual citizens is very minimal. But how they can express so-called their opinions and their will, or perhaps through the neighborhood, may be one way. But apart from that, our concern for neighborhood decision-making or neighborhood governance is also connected to housing. Because if housing is not important, who care about those decision-making? Who care about those service delivery? But because it is connected not just to the services provided by the government or what, it relates to whether you will be able to keep the value of your house because of the provision of neighborhood services. So we have to sidetrack a little bit to look at how those so-called neighborhood or community governance and service delivery has something to do with housing. And it's also because of that, so that the organization of those neighborhood services and neighborhood governance is so complicated, because it has a close connection with housing, and housing itself is complex. At least housing has two attributes that make it complicated. One is housing is a complex good, and housing is also a composite good. So what do we mean by housing is complex? First, it's expensive. In many cities, like Hong Kong, or Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, is very expensive. And housing is also important to our quality of life. So that's why we concern so much on housing. And housing is also an important investment good for most households if they are able to buy the house or the flat they live in. So housing is not a simple unit, but it integrates all those important ingredients of your life. Whether you have a good life, whether you're able to maintain your quality of life when you retire, because you hold a very valuable housing asset. But more important is, we have both. We can enjoy quality of life and a good investment at the same time. So that is not comparable to many other investment opportunities. So that's why people treat housing so special and so valuable. So if this is important, upkeeping of the housing is also important. But that can be individual effort. So you spend investing to change the facility within the house, and you paint all the wall regularly. You keep all those utilities or facilities within your house in a good way. So that's individual decision. But unfortunately, housing is also a composite good that make this effort less effective if you are the only one who do the upkeep and maintenance. Housing is a composite good because when we value housing, we are in fact assessing different attributes of housing. But of course, it is physical structure. So if this is in good structure, of course, it commands good price. And if it is dilapidated, so you need to spend something to strengthen the structure, of course, I mean, you cannot sell high. So that is common sense. But housing is also come along with a stream of housing services. So it is not just the physical structure, but of course, accessibility, ventilation, all those functions that enable you to have a higher quality of life are important for the value of housing. But of course, location and accessibility from outside is perhaps the most important attribute of any housing. So in fact, I mean, people just say that how you value housing. So there's 3 words: location, location, location. I mean, that is something that we repeat thousands of times. But facility and the services is also important, particularly in multi-owned and multi-story buildings or in a gated neighborhood that all those sort of public services are privatized. So of course, the environment is also important. And if you want to enjoy your life and if you're a social animal, your neighborhood is also important because that will enable you to have a good social life. So housing in this way is also a very important status good. But what makes it a status good is very likely not something that you can change or work on your own, because people will seldom visit people's home, but they may look at it from the outside. They may also hear some kind of sort of assessment of the quality of life of that residential sort of neighborhood. So that's all connected to what you can look at from the outside, what you can see, the delivery of services, of course, including the location, the environment. So that's what we call a composite good. So most of them are beyond the control of an individual household. So because of that, when you're trying to maintain your value, location you cannot change, but facility in the neighborhood is very uncertain. But perhaps there is also that you may be able to contribute the decision-making and the investment, but it's uncertain because you also need the cooperation of your neighbors on that. So of course, the structure, the services, there's something that you may be able to control because it's your own sort of investment. But in this collective ownership and collective provision of services, your own contribution is sometimes not possible or insignificant. Because unless you only have a few neighbors, so you can DIY to provide those housing services. Or otherwise, if you have hundreds or even thousands of neighbors, an individual's contribution is negligible. So you need to organize that with some kind of solution that involve the hirings of specialized and dedicated manpower to provide those necessary services. And it's exactly those necessary services that will have to maintain the quality of life and enhance the attribute of housing you own or you live in. So that's the connection with that. But when cities and neighborhood management is concerned, we particularly look at some hotspots that will trigger either problems or conflict, or it needs special attention. So now I'm focusing on the management of the neighborhood, but this will have a connection with how the city is managed. So there are several areas that may be a concern. One is something what we call the common area of that neighborhood. And the other is another concept, what we call very good, but it have a close connection with city management. So at the end, you also need housing management on that. Because I just mentioned that we have created a lot of common area, common facility because of that extensive sharings in a gated so-called neighborhood. And it's organized in a way what we call condominium, which I'll introduce in the later in the lecture. So you cannot, like managing your home, you do it, you hire a domestic helper on that. The managing of the shared area and the common area is more complicated. You need some third party in doing that. And in doing that, you need to develop a lot of contracts, agreements, and on that. And usually in bigger residential neighborhoods, you need to hire a third party company in doing that, particularly in what we call the multifamily housing or apartments. Very good, that is also connected with that, and it directly relate to the management of the city government. Because in many cities, I mean, Hong Kong is a pioneer, and increasingly other Asian cities, Chinese cities follow suit to develop public housing. And public housing is the responsibility of the city government. We develop public housing because we treat housing as a merit good, so that we have to develop and sometimes even subsidize and provide housing for those who cannot afford to solve the housing problem in the market. Very good is an extension of citizen right. So just like minimum income or just like the Social Security. So if somebody who cannot earn enough to support a very minimal, reasonable living, the government will subsidize them, either providing them with Social Security benefit, or like Hong Kong and many Asian cities, legislate for the minimum wage, so that to ensure that they should be able to earn a level of income that will enable to have a decent so-called living. Extended to housing, that we may like to see, housing is provided by the government for those who cannot solve their own housing problem in the market. So that is something what we call a merit good. So usually public housing is the responsibility of the city government. Of course, I mean, in some Chinese cities, it's the responsibility of the district government, but at least that is the local government responsibility. And it's, besides physical provision, we may also involve subsidy and management. So the management can be borne by either the government departments directly, or it can be outsourced to other companies. But at least the managing of the public housing is something closely related to urban management in some way. So because of all of that, you need housing management, either in the private housing or even in the public housing, to have a coordinator on that. So in rental housing, is not just about managing the property itself or the neighborhood services, is also about what we call the tenancy control or leasing control of that. So it so happened, later on I'll return to the theme, that because of the need for a large scale management of public housing, for instance, in Hong Kong, it helped to develop a career path and later on some professionals that are experts in housing management. All this I just mentioned, the need for neighborhood governance, the significance of housing, and that is quite general because this will also apply to other so-called cities around the world. It will apply when they have a need to build multi-family and multi-owned housing. Multi-family and multi-owned may not be so-called sit together always, because in many countries, either the legislation or the tax system will discourage the combination of these two, because they will see this as very problematic, very problematic. So if it is a house being owned by an individual, it has to be a house. So it attached with the land, and also you have a defined boundary, so you can hold individual household responsible. So if you build multifamily housing, you need to have a single owner. So there's all those residents in those multifamily housing, they are all tenants. So multifamily and multi-owned may not be the same thing, But increasingly, they combine with each other because of the need to recycle all the investment. So it's better to sell the individual unit rather than to keep the individual unit and rent it out to individuals. But in some cities, because of the tax code, it becomes very complicated. So the investor, they prefer, because these are the exceptional cases. So, but in Hong Kong and other Chinese cities, there may be some very special characteristic, what we call the local specificity, that will have an impact on how urban and housing management is developed in such a way. So this may be worth noting because it may help us to understand more about how the system is come about, and also what are the connection with the wider social, economic, and political environment. There are a few things that I would like to mention, and that will apply mostly to Hong Kong and to some big Chinese cities, and also to some big Asian city as well. But it may not be generally applicable to every city, even cities in China or even in Asia. One thing is about this very special characteristic of how the cities is very developed because of the high density development. Sorry for the typo, it should be high density development. And the second is about the oligarchy of supply of housing. The third is about the governance structure that are set up for the ownership and management of those so-called neighborhoods. And the fourth one is about the creation of some special kind of practitioner that are connected to the provision of services in those neighborhoods. High density development is important, but it's not as important as big scale development. So this perhaps is one of the earliest characteristics of Hong Kong. Perhaps we can trace the history to the 1960s and 1970s. Because we have high density development to begin with. So when they need to expand the city to what we call the new territories, they also will develop that, to plan that as high density development. If we look at it from translated into a number, what we call the plot ratio. So I would say that most of you know plot ratio is, but if not, let me explain a little bit. Plot ratio is the total area, the housing, the building area you can develop compared with the land base. So if the plot ratio is 10, then with a piece of land, you can build 10 stories. So the total area is just 10 times the land area. So in Hong Kong, many of the plot ratio in the urban area is very high. So it can be 9, it can be 10, and the highest is in fact 15 in some developed area in Hong Kong Island. Whereas in most other cities, when you extend your city to the suburb, usually they have very low density. Not to mention about North American cities, Canadian cities. Even you look at Japan. Japan, in fact, outside the city proper of Tokyo, in the peripheral, they're all houses. So the plot ratio is very low. It can be 1, it can be 1, it can be 1.5, or even smaller than 1. It can be 0.5 because they can have a garden. So even if you haven't traveled to this part of Tokyo or Osaka suburb, you just look at those so-called soap operas on TV, the Japanese soap opera on TV. They're all houses. Even they live in Tokyo or in Osaka, they can live in houses because in the suburbs, they're all houses. They seldom have high density development in the suburb, but that's not the Hong Kong style. Hong Kong started from the 60s when they developed new towns. They have already planned it as high density development. The plot ratio can be 4.5 or 5, or sometimes even 6. Whereas in the real suburb of Hong Kong, the plot ratio that's allowed is 0.4. So that's not comparable. So the new town is high density development. So how you can save costs on those new development? So at that time, the colonial government has a very good idea. There's an idea not originated in Hong Kong, but perhaps extensively used in Hong Kong. So they just earmark a very big piece of land to the developer. But the developer has to shoulder all infrastructure construction. So the government at that time do not have to spend a lot of public money to expand the city. Even to take back the land of the city, turn it from rural land to urban land, they also didn't have to spend a single dollar on that. They just issue a letter, a certificate, allowing the landowner to exchange with some kind of formula the land that are developed in the new town. So many of you all know that, particularly those from mainland China, that now in many provinces, I think it's allocated in Chongqing, that they just issue a letter and take the land, but without paying anything. But that was already the extensive policy that Hong Kong have used in the 60s and throughout the 90s. And if it is not the 1997 issue, they will continue because there is a debt. And Chinese government would not like the British government to leave a lot of such debt to the new SAR government. So they stopped that in the 90s. So they have to redeem all those certificates and letters before 1997. Of course, they will not give you money. They will give you land in exchange. And this certificates and letter is a tradable commodity that once command a very high price, because you all know that the value of the rural land and the value of the urban land is not comparable. Because of that, so all the new towns are developed in such a way. So they have very large piece of land that are sold to the developer. So of course, the developer will end up building big community that we just described. So within those neighborhoods, the provision of services are private, but it's supposed to be public services if this is not what we call a condominium type of development. So it creates a lot of share and common area. So because of that, the government not just saving the cost of construction, they will also save a little bit, of course, not too much, because the service that are involved is not that many, but at least they have achieved some kind of saving of public provision of services to those neighborhoods. So the construction costs and the responsibility of providing services are shifted to the developers, to the developer. So the government at that time has to do that because unlike nowadays, the government of Hong Kong at any time, in fact, before the 90s, was very poor. I mean, they don't have any sort of fiscal reserve on that. So because of that, not just high density development, and also because they earmark a big piece of land for development, it creates a lot of share and common areas and facilities. Not to mention that we have a very big public housing sector. Once the public housing sector constitutes 45% of all population in Hong Kong. The public housing sector at that time is not the same so-called coverage as the public housing now, because what I mean about 45% are those in rental housing, owned and managed by the Hong Kong government. But now, in fact, we only have about 29% of people live in that public housing. The usual figures we quote, about half of the population in public housing in Hong Kong also include about 16 to 17% of people who live in home ownership scheme flat, which are in fact owner-occupied. It's public, but it's not rental. So the owners, like ordinary private neighborhoods, they have to take care of those management and decision making. So relative size, we have shrinking, but we still maintain a very big public housing program that now accumulate close to 1 million so-called household in that sector. To be exact, it's about 860,000. Because of that arrangement, in fact, we have a big piece of land to develop and manage. So you can imagine all the small developer would not dare to take such a risk. Of course, I mean, it seems to be common sense that we have only a few big developers in Hong Kong, and real estate development will never lose money. No, it's not the case. In fact, in the 60s and in the 70s, we have several dozens of developers. They are all very small. The biggest developer, in fact, like Hong Kong Land at that time, is the biggest developer, and landowners in Hong Kong, they have no interest in developing residential housing because of the risk that is involved. Because you all know that house price will come ups and downs. So that's, in fact, a very big risk. So why we end up with that 4 to 7 about big developer is a matter of competition and a matter of survival skills. So we still have a lot of medium-sized developer. Not to mention we have a lot of small-sized developer in Hong Kong, but they are negligible in terms of the market share. Because if you have a big piece of land, only those who have the big guts, they want to take risks, and a very deep pocket can shoulder just development because it's the high risk. And also, if you are not big enough, the bank would not lend you money. So without the bank support, in fact, you cannot do anything. So that's why the big piece of land for development is a direct cause creating the oligarchy of provision of private housing in Hong Kong. And I just mentioned that it is not just the developing of housing and infrastructure. They also have to take care of the common areas, common facilities, and shared space within their development. So all of those developers, they have their own property management being set up. In fact, before 1993, they have monopoly on that. Because once they take over the management of those new developments, they can keep it forever. They can keep it forever. There is no way the residents can fire them. But of course, the law changed in 1993, allowing the owners with some kind of threshold decision to fire those developers management agent, what we call the DMC manager, the deed of mutual confidence manager. But you need supermajority to exercise that. That is at least 51% of all the shares in those development projects, which is very often impossible. So there are only a few cases the residents are able to do that. Because of that, that creates a monopoly of private service provision. And also in the public sector, the service provision is also monopolistic because they are all being provided by the housing authority. That situation persists until the year 2000, when they begin to privatize public housing management. But before that, we have public housing from about 56, 57. The first public housing was being completed, I think it's 57, 58. So that all those 40 years or so till the year 2000, they have monopoly in public housing service provision. Because of the existence of those big players both in the public sector and the private sector, it creates a lot of power imbalance. So before 1993, all those property management agents, the DMC manager and those big developers, they can kill it forever. So you can imagine, why should I take note of any suggestion request of the residents? Because anyway, I can keep my job and there's no way you can drive me out. And that is also the case in public sector. It's even worse, I would say that. Not only their monopoly, and also because getting into public housing is already regarded as something of welfare. So if you are not satisfied with the service provision, probably you can go out, go away. I don't care. So it makes housing management in Hong Kong at that time in a more prominent position in terms of that power. And in the governance structure, I just mentioned that in the private sector is organized in the terms of condominium, which I'll explain later in a later lecture. But it is very difficult, in fact, to change the internal rules, internal constitution of that, what we call the DMC, because of some special arrangement, which I'll also arrange later. So, and at the same time, the establishment of owners' organization to exercise ownership and decision-making is not mandatory. So the law doesn't require that. So you can imagine that forming of those organizations will be very, very difficult. And it's the case. It's the case. Because of that, there's no counteracting force within the neighborhood on that. And the privatized public housing management would even exacerbate those contradictions. Lastly, is about the emergence of a special group of practitioners. And it has something to do with colonial legacy, because at a time when public housing was developed in the 50s, they need somebody who have the knowledge and expert to manage public housing. It so happened that housing management in the UK has a very long history. You can trace the history on the earlier 20th century. So they have more than 100 years of history now. So that is a very handy manpower they can use. So at the very first instance, in the first day, they imported housing manager from the UK to set up the management system in public housing. And that make housing manager as a dominating workforce in public housing sector. And later on, in the 60s, private housing also developed in a large scale. And again, you need somebody who have expertise to manage housing of such a scale. So where do you find that? Public housing. So they just hunt those experienced practitioners in the public sector to work in the private sector. So the system of the public housing are being transferred to the private housing, of course, with some adaptation in this way. And with all that history of the proliferation, that a special practice or a special operation system has been set up in both the public sector and the private sector in Hong Kong, which have few parallels in other parts of the world. Even housing management in the UK was not practiced in this way, because most of their public housing are houses. Even they have a few tower blocks. Many of them are being demolished in recent years. So they are not managed in this way. Whereas Hong Kong specialized in this high density, high development, and multi-story buildings, private sector, multi-owned building. And this practice, in fact, was also exported to China, firstly in Shenzhen, because when China developed private housing, Hong Kong is perhaps the most handy example they can take. So now, in fact, many of the management practice, neighborhood management practice in Shenzhen have quite a lot of commonality with that of Hong Kong. Of course, each cities will have an adaptation of their own. And perhaps we take a break of 5 minutes before I continue. Okay, let us resume. Let me see so far. Any of you have any problem or anything that I explained too briefly, or some jargons or terms you may hinder your learning progress? For those who attend the lecture through Zoom, you can either turn on your microphone and speak, or you can write it down in the chat box. See anything I need to explain further or follow up? Okay, if not, I will continue with that. We just mentioned that we focus on that continuum of managing the cities and managing your home. And we focus more, particularly when housing management is concerned, on the management of that neighborhood. And particularly, we emphasize that the contradiction or the problem reason because of the collective ownership, a lot of common and shared areas and facilities, and against the context of what we call a private provision of public services, it creates a lot of contradiction and problems. And part of them is exhibited in what we call competed demands because of that public provision of private services. It doesn't just apply to services to the neighborhood, but largely to the provision of all kinds of public services. So in fact, for those housing students, you may be working in the field for very long, but in fact, you some of you may not think of the services you provided every day to your residents are public services. But if you compare that with similar situation in some North American cities, you realize that in fact, we are providing public services within the neighborhood. So it has some kind of public nature, although it's being paid privately. So it creates some competing demands. I'm able to just mention a few. And that competing demand was created because of the different nature and expectation of public and private provision of services. But the other is also about neighborhood politics, because of the expectation of the residents as a owner, as a tenant, versus them as a citizen. The first one is what we call the contradiction on contractual and social responsibility. As a service provider, of course, I would work on the contractual obligation. I'm responsible as an outsourced vendor of cleaning, so I just work within the contract we have signed. So that's natural for a business organization. So with that, they will try to eliminate or at least minimize all those social objectives to maximize their profit. Of course, nowadays, because of the emphasis on what we call the ESG, the environment, social, and governance responsibility, and that will make complicated because that will also apply to ordinary for-profit business organization. But before that wave, in fact, all the social responsibility are the responsibility of the government. As a business organization, we have no obligation on that. So don't tell me about all those equal opportunity, those care for the marginalized group. There's none of our business. My business is just to maximize the benefits of my shareholders or my owners. So most of them, in fact, the eliminate social objective is the way to maximize their profit, because if they need to take in social responsibility, more or less it will eat into their profit. So I mean, that is something that not difficult to understand. And this emphasis will undermine the interaction with the environment. Of course, I'm talking about something of the past, although now is begin to change, but the change, in fact, is just begun. So there's no obvious outcome of that. So people may just say that, but may not do that, even for the big business. So that will largely apply. For normal private business, it may not be a big problem. So if you're selling watch, you're selling your iPhone, I mean, that's maybe not a problem. But your provision is a private provision of public services. How can you take out social objective and the so-called concern for the environment? I mean, this kind of thing. Because as a service user and as a citizen, I may have different expectation on that. So that will have create some kind of competing demands. But if you want to achieve social responsibility, and that will impose some pressure on the efficiency. So that will even apply for public sector service provider. For public sector service provider, it's their responsibility to discharge their social responsibility. Even if for the housing department, they don't care about profit, but at least they care about efficiency. So that may be a pressure for them. So for the private sector, is the emphasis of contractual obligation that may create competing demand for social responsibility, whereas for the public sector operators, they emphasize social responsibility, but at that time, they're also being dragged and constrained by the contractual obligation on that. The second competing demand is what we call the competing demand for individual and collective services. Well, I just mentioned that the public provision of private services are reasoned because of the need to provide public services within that neighborhood. But the public service is, in fact, provided to individuals, and it's a private provision that the individual have to directly pay for that services. But it creates some kind of contradiction because I pay for the services, but within the context of that collective governance and decision-making, I don't feel myself being empowered to make such a decision. I'm not satisfied with the service provider, but I cannot make any decision to fire and change them. Because you need to go through all the collective governance and decision-making mechanism, which is a chaos or even non-existent. So the service provider, because of the individual customers or the service users, they cannot make direct decision. So why should I take their request and demand seriously? Because anyway, you cannot fire me. So that will create a contradiction. But at the same time, from the service provider point of view, they may see that because of some kind of collective services that are provided, regardless you like it or not, regardless you use it or not, I need to provide because that is a collective services. It's not just to a particular individuals, but to the collective. I run a lift, so I cannot make it stop, but perhaps nobody will use that. So those who use that the services, they may not appreciate the provision of services because they don't think the services is targeted at me. It's targeted at individuals, my neighbors, irrelevant. So that is also some of the root of the conflict between the residents and the service provider. The third competing demand is about service and profit. And of course, it also connects to the first competing demand I just mentioned about social responsibility and also contractual obligation, because contractual obligation will help you to generate profit. So the service provision, in theory, should be linked to your performance of services. But because of the first contradictions, in fact, it may not. So I provide service, but regardless I do it good or not, it may not affect my profit. Because those who use that, those who evaluate the service, may have no influence on the profit I get because of that detachment. But again, at the other end, you provide good services doesn't mean that you get higher profit. And I run a restaurant, I directly interact with my patrons. If they like my food, they may buy more, I get more profit. But at least not in the public provision or private provision of public services in those neighborhoods. When you do better, you will not get more profit. You only get more job, more work. And you work harder and we will not earn you more profit. And sometimes when you want some ideas to generate profit, but the residents may not allow you, although it may benefit both. That is exactly what the difference between the operation in Hong Kong and mainland China. So of course, many of you realize that many property management companies in mainland China, they are going to the stock market to have the IPO, so to raise funds for the operation. So if you look at how they earn the money, most of them, in fact, they are unable to get a profit out of the regular services because the management charge is tightly controlled by the government. But the demand for the residents is much, much higher. So for a long time, I did research on these areas and interviewed all the big and small property management companies in various cities in China. They all complain that it's a money-losing business. I mean, some are true because for the big developers, in fact, they do it losing money to exchange for the goodwill so that the housing subsequent project can sell better. So they run at a loss. But suddenly, we realize from the financial reports of all those listed property management companies, they make a lot of profit. They make a lot of profit. So where the profits come from? From what they call value-added services. But of course, this idea is not new. In fact, in Hong Kong, about 10, 15 years ago, we already have a few companies who do that. Have value-added services provided to the residents so that to bring convenience to the residents and they have their profit. But they soon, when the owner organization discovered that, they stop all that because that's not allowed. That's not allowed. That's not allowed in the contract. So anything that would benefit both, have a win-win situation, may not be allowed because of that. So that is a contradiction. Even you have a good idea to provide good service, but it doesn't mean that you're able to generate profit out of that. The last one is about the competing demand of being a customer and the responsibility of the neighborhood management agent. As a service provider, you need to have your customers satisfied. If they're happy, they will allow you to continue, and you have work, you can continue to make profit. But because this is a collective service, and the collective service, in fact, for many of the governance function, is basically a control function. Of course, they provide service, but the main responsibility of those management agents in the neighborhoods is control. Not allow the residents to do this and do that, because this is written down in the Constitution, is also for the benefit of the whole collective. Take, for example, you cannot paint out, you cannot change the color of your window, because that is being written down in the DMC, and your neighbor will complain because it will make the outlook of your building not uniform, so it's not beautiful. So that is basically a control function. So that control functions, in fact, will contradict with the experience of individual residents who are being controlled, who are subject to control. And this have intensified in many Chinese cities when the local government is also involved in neighborhood governance. And whether the neighborhood is governed properly is a key performance indicator of those local organization of the government. For instance, the street office, the residence committee. So that control function is directly at odds with all those customer satisfaction, because they create different so-called demand on that, and that is an intrinsic so-called contradiction. With that, we propose that we will look at those issues and phenomenon from a special angle. So we develop a general analytic framework on that, and it's what we call it a social construction perspective. Social construction perspective will study housing and urban management, the governance, the service provision in the neighborhood as a social phenomenon. It is not something technical. It's not just about the operation, and we have to take it holistically to look at it from the root. So we will divide it up, the analysis, into different levels. The structural, the institution, the organization, the operation, and also the subjective sort of dimension. What do you mean by structure? The structure is about the culture, it's about the value belief, and the basic social system. Institution is under those systems, how the institution and the agency is being set up, and how what and how policy is being developed and implemented. Organization is within those institutions. What kind of organization are being set up? What are the missions of those organizations? And what are the operational level, the daily operation of those service provision? But down to earth, in fact, any operation has to be looked at it from the interaction of people. So in the subjectivity, it's not just an interaction of people. It is how people look at each other and how people look at others who look at ourselves. It's a little bit abstract and complicated. But very often, in fact, if we take a very simple example. Sometimes what we mean by our self-image, so if somebody asks you who you are, I mean, what kind of people you are, in fact, you are not formulating that purely from your own imagination. It's basically you take in other people's perception, comments, and suggestion, and then you make a portrait of what I will be like from the eyes of others. So that is something that what we call intersubjectivities. So something that we think is our own thinking, our own perception, our belief, in fact, it's not totally ours. It's being shaped by the interaction with people. But more important is how you guess other people think, how you guess other people think what I think. So in daily life, we are involved in this kind of game. So we think what other people think. Perhaps it's more vivid when you look at your relation with your boss. So sometimes we don't directly ask our boss, we guess what our boss think. So we guess what our boss think about me. So I will organize my behavior, my performance in such a way. But who knows whether that's really what your boss think? But we don't care. We just guess. And people will never, or very seldom, they will communicate directly on that. So that's something that we call intersubjectivity. So the social construction approach, in fact, is also very important to mention intersubjectivity. But intersubjectivity is not just created by our own imagination and thinking. It's shaped upward by the operation, the daily interaction with people, what organization we are looking at, we are situated, and that organization is being influenced by the upper level institution and also what we call the structural arrangement of the society. To explain it a little bit down to earth and connected to our subject of study, what we mean by structural is about how the society is being organized, particularly the economic system. So we are a capitalist society, so we place utmost importance to the respect and the protection of private ownership. In contrast, if we are a socialist system, we are concerned about the collective property and private ownership is non-existent, and you have to take command of some kind of central order because we need to plan the society in an organized way. And this is important when we have to understand the situation in mainland China, because mainland China still does not proclaim herself to be a capitalist society. It's still a socialist country. But it's true in a way that many of the organization and socialist legacy still persists, particularly about the connection with the government, with the state, and collective properties. But in essence, it's more capitalist than many capitalist countries. So that is something that connected to the structural arrangement of the society. So that will influence on how law is being enacted and implemented. So we have a different system of law in Hong Kong, what we call the common law, whereas in mainland China is the continental law. And that is also the system of law in Japan and China and Korea as well. So the understanding of how the law is made and implemented is very different. And because of those so-called beliefs and how the system is organized, it will also have an impact on how policy is made. And specifically is about how you look at what we call state intervention. So how the state is being involved. So you will see that the state's involvement in our daily life is very different across the border. But to complicate that, state involvement is undergo abrupt change because of the introduction what we call liberal policy, taking public policy as business operation, to make it simple, so that we're concerned about the market, we're concerned about competition, we're concerned about consumer sovereignty, and that's all translated in the provision of public services. So that will complicate our discussion of the private provision of public services. So we will look at how property rights is being observed in Hong Kong, but why some of the rights of ownership being protected by the Constitution is being frequently infringed in the neighborhood of China. So that may be some kind of the system design and also the legacy of the previous so-called system. Institution will follow from the system. Because we have a capitalist system, so most housing are presumed to be private. So public housing as an institution is very special. So that will also explain why in mainland China, when they abolished the public housing system, which all housing are owned by the work unit, when they have market reform. So she have to wait for several decades before introducing public housing as an institution to look after those who cannot look after themselves in the private housing market. With construction of the state for housing provision and also involve a little bit subsidies. Whereas in Hong Kong as an institution, it involves very deep subsidy on public rental housing. And there is also an institution adapted from that system of what we call the respect for private property, but at the same time also pragmatic that we will use private resources to develop so-called land for city development by assigning big piece of land to the private developer. That's an institutional arrangement. And social control in China is also an institutional arrangement because that perhaps may be part of the legacy of the political system and also part of the system that are not exactly circumscribed by the constitution of the state. I mean the Communist Party. Communist Party is largely above the state and largely outside of the political system. So it seems to be some kind of superpower that run China, and that interact with some of the constitutional rights and protection of the law to generate some kind of conflict in what we call the neighborhood governance. We will explain more in a subsequent lecture. And whether the owners' organization is mandatory is also an institutional arrangement. And with that, whether it's mandatory or whether it is not mandatory, whether how you make the constitution, how you change the constitution is a result of interaction of how you interpret the so-called the overarching social system. Take for example, in Hong Kong, we respect private property. So we engage in private contract in what we call the deed of mutual confidence. So if you want to change the deed of mutual confidence, the constitution of your neighborhood, you need the consent of all the parties who sign the contract. So that's 100% of ownership. So you observe that that is nearly impossible. But that is an institutional arrangement that will implement the so-called the system design. So with that institutional arrangement, that comes our concern for a solution and how you conceptualize that problem. So the collective decision-making or collective institutional so-called ownership arrangement create what we call a collective action dilemma, which we'll discuss in subsequent lectures. So with the institutional setup, you still need organization to implement that rules that are made in that institutional design. So the public sector, whether they take the management of the neighborhood directly or indirectly, is an organization design. So in Hong Kong, they started with taking it directly to set up a public organization, the housing department, to take care of that. But later on, they will find this competing demand about efficiency, about contractual arrangement. So they privatize that. So privatization is an organization arrangement or organization change. And what kind of personnel they use, whether it's what we call a dedicated professional rationale or some kind of just general practitioner, is also an organization level development. So the monopoly of the private management company is also an organization arrangement. But more important is within the organization, why there's monopoly, but there may not be a lot of conflict, but instead the performance of those property management agents, which are the subsidiary of the developer, very often has a very, very so-called good feedback. So that may be something on the organization decision. So I just mentioned that even in mainland China, some big developer, they run the management services at a loss because they want to exchange those so-called subsidy with a goodwill so that they can sell subsequent project better. There's also concern for many big developers in Hong Kong. So the issues in housing management it's a public sector organization as an outsourced organization also connect to our organization level of analysis. Whereas within the organization, there can be a lot of operation. That is something that we cannot include too many, but we just will single out a few operations which may have a larger implication. Take for example, we have a lecture to look at what we call the marking scheme of the Hong Kong Housing Authority, which is of operational practice. So most operational practice, they are ordinary, they are mundane, they are insignificant to look at. But the marking scheme may have a lot of contradiction because of the implication, because of this connection to other social issues, what we call changing citizens' behavior or exchange welfare with some kind of obligation to the government. And the operational level, for a very long time, we have law that prevent the establishment, the formation of owners corporation. But after the law, such restriction ended, most big developers with their subsidiaries, property management agent, they all work hard with a single mission. In fact, is to prevent the formation of owners corporation, because once is formed, they will run a risk of proposing to change the management agent. So they work hard on that. So there's some kind of operation arrangement. And at the same time, housing allocation in the public sector is also an allocation and operation practice, but also have a wider social implication. Take for example, about social exclusion, about discrimination. Inner subjectivity is perhaps very important and very subtle. So we may not have so much room in that. So in fact, we are unable to cover this particular angle of an analysis. But I can tell that in the neighborhood governance and management concern, professionalization may be one very important area. This particular analytic perspective may help. Why? housing management can be professionalized, and what are the professional image of that? So particularly about low professional image, because that is what I just mentioned. How you look at others, look at you. But because of the limitation of time, we don't have that. So in the organization of the lecture, we roughly divided up the lecture into several themes that were organized around context, urban management, and housing management. And of course, because of the need for the housing students, we may bias a little bit more towards housing management on that. So with the social construction perspective, we will look at, after this overview, the institutional arrangement that most of those neighborhood governance setup and operation will base on is the land and housing ownership system. And Hong Kong and mainland China share a lot in common in that system. Because I've just mentioned that at the time when China embarked on the reform, the operation and system in Hong Kong is the most handy one. And in housing management, we'll look at collective action as the conceptual basis and look at how governance in a neighborhood can derive some kind of systems and solve some of the problems. The discussion may be a little bit theoretical, but I'll try to link it up with some kind of more sort of down-to-earth example. Try to look at what possible solutions there are to solve the problem of governance and management at the neighborhood. So as to say, to address collective action dilemma. It can be a market solution, it can be an institutional solution, but whereas in China, there is a particular political dimension that are involved. So that is the political mission of social control at the neighborhood. So I'll also spend some time on that because that is my main research in the last 15 years, in fact. And in the public sector, we also will look at how the operation is being made in the special need housing, how to shape tenants' behavior with the marking scheme, and how to manage resources in the public housing sector, is particular about subsidy and about allocation. We're about in urban management, we'll touch on two themes on managing the cities, but not in a very general sense, but we'll take up two particular sort of aspect of theme. One is about the smart cities, and the other is about urban planning. Of course, for students from the MUDP, you may be sort of more familiar with that, but we will look at it from a neighborhood governance example. Although in our discussion, it may not be that direct as housing management, but that will have an implication because I just mentioned that how we partition the plot of land for development, how big it is, what kind of infrastructure it will take, it's something of the result of urban planning. And with that, there are a lot of issues about power distribution, about participation of ordinary citizens, and also about the resistance, what we call the insurgents. Smart cities are new concept, but smart cities seems to benefit the city or the city government more than ordinary residents. So we'll look at it not just from a very positive sort of angle, but we also look at what we call the political dimension of that. How it connect with, for instance, social control, individual freedoms, I mean, this kind of ideas. So that is what we organize, because I just mentioned that this is the first time we put up all the lecture in a single course. So in between, perhaps we may need some kind of coordination because they are being taught by sort of different lecturers. So in case there are duplication or omissions, do inform me so that I can make some kind of supplement or complement in the last lecture. So I have a very short summary. This lecture, I intend to give some context and how we approach the topic in this course. So we have interest because of the multi-owned buildings and neighborhood that will create an issue of public provision of private services, and also the existence of public housing sectors, very big in Hong Kong and increasingly bigger in Chinese cities. And that will create competing demands as well as some very special interaction in the political and social arena. And we'll try or attempt to look at such questions and issues as a social phenomenon with an approach what we call social construction. If you want to know more, I have the reference on that. So we'll first identify its root from the structure, from the institutional setup, from the organization, from the operation, and also from the intersubjective interaction between different individuals in the daily life. And that is perhaps what I want to cover. Something before we end, what I want to mention about the seminars. So there will not be any meetings in week 1. And in week 2, next week, all groups, regardless you're even week or odd week, will meet. And basically, we will do the division of labor or the presentation to allow you to better prepare. We can only do it in week 2 because some people can still add and drop within this period. So until it's settled, I think it's no use to make the division. So do note this special arrangement about venue and time. Two groups, of course, with so-called free labels, will meet after the lecture here. But we are unable to find another room big enough to hold the other half of the class. So we need to divide it up in different time. So perhaps the second group, you may have to wait a little bit longer on that. So it's almost, time is almost up. So anybody have any concern, any question, any suggestion you would like to raise with me?
Yes. For the seminars, if there is a group work, how many people will be a group?
We have set 4 topics. So it depends on the size of the group. So if the seminar group is, we have quite big group now, is perhaps because it's 28, then we may have 7 people in a group for presentation. I know that it's a little bit difficult to coordinate, so try your best. You need not to be very coherent. So as long as you can have a division of labor, and you do not need a consensus. You do not need a consensus. As long as you can divide it up the flow of the presentation, you can have contrasting view on that. Because I know that this collective action dilemma is difficult to make a collective decision when the group size is so big, 6 or 7. So I would like the group size to be even. But for some bigger group, it also mean quite a big group. But I think we need to accept the reality on that. But for the term paper, we would only allow at most 2 students doing a paper. You can choose to do the paper on your own. Because we know that the bigger the group is, it may not improve the quality of the paper, but instead it will drag it down because of the difficulties in coordination. But in presentation, there is very little room we can maneuver. Your tutor will explain in a little bit more detail next week to you, so don't worry. But until then, if you have any concern or question, you can always email me to alert me. Okay, if not, we'll see you next week. Sorry, can I would like to address some of the concerns that are raised in the checkbox. Sorry that I missed that. For how you divide up the group, I'll let the tutor to inform you. So I'm not quite sure how they will do that. We don't have any policy on that. And also for the slide I presented today, I'll also put up on campus afterwards.